Good morning, everyone, and welcome to some stops along the way. Today, we're going to continue our look at the country of Cambodia. This is the second of two episodes about my work in the country. And last episode, was almost totally filled with a story that I shared about my friend and colleague Lee Hang, who endured the genocide between 1975 and 1979 when the communist Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia. She has not written a book about it. I shared the story as much as I could that she shared with me. But there have been many books written about this period. One of the best that I've read is this one, called First They Killed My Father. It's written by a young lady named Lung Ong, who is now involved in fighting against mines around the world. And she is an amazing writer. It's a compelling story. There's so many stories like this from Cambodians. Don't read this if you're depressed, because it is heavy. But it is also a book that can give you a little bit of a window into that period between 1975 and 79 when the Khmer Rouge ruled the country. Today's episode is going to focus primarily on the rise of the Khmer Rouge, or the rise and fall, let's say, of the Khmer Rouge, as well as their leader, Pol Pot. But before we get into that, lest you think that Cambodia is an absolutely lost cause that you would never want to visit, I hope you'll reconsider that, because Cambodia is an amazing country. My time there was spent eating great food, making friends that I'll have for the rest of my life, and witnessing some of the most beautiful scenery and ancient customs that I've seen anywhere in the world. It's a marvelous place to visit. It's an inexpensive place to visit, and it's one that I would very much encourage anyone to add to their travel list. But this morning, I want to share a story with you from my experience in the country that hopefully will highlight how fascinating it is. And then we'll get into some of the more macabre elements of the country's history that I alluded to in the last episode. But first, when I was there, I had the opportunity to travel to this ancient temple called Angkor Wat. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is an absolutely amazing place. Ancient temple carved out of the jungle. It's like nothing you've ever seen before. It's like a dream sequence going there, really. Many people go there by road or by air from the capital of Phnom Penh. I took the time to go by river. I hired a boat captain who had a nice sailing boat he and his brother to take myself and a colleague up the river and through the lake to the city of Siem Reap, near where Angkor Wat is located. The Tonle Sap River and Tonle Sap Lake that we sailed through to get to Angkor Wat was an experience on its own. I would encourage anybody that goes to Cambodia, rather than driving or flying from Phnom Penh to Siem Reap to go to Angkor Wat, to take the river and the lake, because if you have the time, it is just fantastic. It takes about 8 or 8.5 hours, but it is well worth the trip. And when I departed that boat and took the short tuk-tuk ride to Angkor Wat, it was like nothing that I had ever experienced. Even the Taj Mahal, in its own way, was not as impressive to me as Angkor Wat, just because the location of this temple is what one envisions when they go to Southeast Asia. And there are so many sites in Cambodia that are worth seeing, that are beautiful and pristine and ancient and really otherworldly. And the people are just fantastic. Which makes you wonder how this whole episode of the genocide between 1975 and 79 took place. Because when you meet Cambodians, not only are they just wonderful people, but they're Buddhist. And Buddhists are typically very peaceful people. And yet this period of 75 to 79 was so violent and so against the character of Cambodians that one wonders how it happened at all. Well, let me give you a little bit of an insight into that this morning. Remember what I said in the last episode, that in the 1970s, much of the conflict around the world, including in Cambodia, was generated by this ideological struggle between democracy and communism. And certainly Southeast Asia in the 1970s became a prime example of that, with the war in Vietnam, which spilled over into Cambodia, and then with the rise of the communists, the Khmer Rouge, in Cambodia itself. In the 1990s, much of the conflict and angst was focused on nationalism, as I said before. And so, as we look at how the Khmer Rouge came to be, we can't just look at that period of the 1970s. We have to go back even to the 1950s, when the Khmer Rouge began to organize itself. The Khmer Rouge is a name that was given by the former king Norodom Sihanouk to the country's heterogeneous communist-led dissidents. The official name of the Khmer Rouge was the Communist Party of Kampuchea. So let's talk a little bit about how this came to be. The Cambodian Revolutionary Army was slowly built up from the forest of eastern Cambodia during the 1960s. And at that time, it was supported by the People's Army of Vietnam, the Viet Cong, and the Chinese government. Although it originally fought against King Sihanouk, the Khmer Rouge changed its position to support him following the Communist Party of China's advice, and after he was overthrown in a coup in 1970. The person who overthrew him was a U.S.-backed ruler by the name of Lon Nol. And he established a republic called the Khmer Republic, which was very much pro-American. Now remember, during this time, the Americans were locked in a battle for the hearts and minds of Southeast Asians, especially Vietnamese, but to a lesser degree Cambodians as well. And they were very much fighting against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, and therefore the communist influence, especially the influence of China. Remember that in the 1950s, the Korean conflict had really kicked off this period in Southeast Asia of struggle between the Chinese, especially, and the Americans, and to a lesser degree, the West, to prevent the spread of communism, which there was a fear that the communists would take over the entirety of Southeast Asia. Of course, in Korea, there ended up being a demarcation line with communist North Korea and pro-Western South Korea. But in Cambodia and in Vietnam, it was really an all or nothing proposition. So at the time that everything was happening and the Khmer Rouge began to form itself in the jungles of Cambodia, there was the Americans were somewhat distracted by Vietnam, which they felt was the first and biggest domino in Southeast Asia that could fall, and therefore ignite a string of communist interventions in that region. And so one could argue that while Lon Nol's government was pro-American, it likely didn't receive the kind of attention or support that it needed. Even so, the Americans launched a massive bombing campaign. It was called Operation Freedom Deal against the Khmer Rouge. But even so, the Khmer Rouge won the Cambodian Civil War and captured Phnom Penh, the Cambodian capital, in 1975. Now, again, remember, this was at the end of the Vietnam conflict. So when all of this was going on, the focus of the Americans was first to try to win in Vietnam and then to try to exit with dignity in Vietnam. So even with this massive bombing campaign against Khmer Rouge, it was not enough to thwart their efforts to take over the country. And remember, Khmer Rouge was a very loose army. They lived in the forest. They were more guerrilla fighters than an organized army, which makes this kind of air power less effective because they had built-in positions, tunnels, etc. They could simply endure the airstrikes and then come back into the jungles and resume their operations. We were trying to fight a conventional war against an unconventional army, and of course, it was unsuccessful. Following their victory, the Khmer Rouge, who were led by a character by the name of Pol Pot, who we'll talk about in a few moments, and a number of others, immediately set about to forcibly evacuate the country's major cities. In 1976, they renamed the country Democratic Kampuchea. You might wonder, why are they evacuating the cities? We'll talk more about this in a few moments. I touched on it in the first episode, but we'll come back to it. What you need to understand about the Khmer Rouge regime is that it was highly autocratic, totalitarian, and repressive. It was responsible for untold deaths in the country. We'll give some numbers a little bit later on, but I don't think there's any way even to quantify the number of deaths that were caused by the Khmer Rouge. And all of this was created by its social engineering policies. The which were an imitation of of China's Great Leap Forward, which had caused the Great Chinese Famine. Now, there's a reason for this. The major backers of the Khmer Rouge were the Chinese. And so the example that the Khmer Rouge had of this type of revolutionary action was largely the Chinese example. The problem was the Chinese example didn't work. And so they were trying to copy something, especially a social engineering policy, that had already failed. And was certainly destined to fail in a smaller country like Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge's attempts at agricultural reform through collectivization led to widespread famine, while its insistence on absolute self-sufficiency, including the supply of medicine and agriculture products, led to the deaths of thousands from famine and treatable diseases such as malaria. They created a closed society. They created a society that they wanted to be self-sufficient, where the workers, in this case, those that lived in the rural areas, could have a role and a place in society that was elevated from where they were, certainly under Lon Nol's regime, where it was at least perceived that those highly educated people in the cities really controlled the country and the economy, while those farmers in rural areas were abjectly poor. Of course, this has been a struggle that has driven communist idealism for generations. This idea of parity, this idea that those who are intellectual and those who are in government are somehow the enemy, somehow have an advantage over those who are not. And this led to the idea of parity in society, both social and economic parity, which of course has been proven not to be realistic. Because even under the communist regime in China, in China, Russia, Vietnam, and of course in Cambodia, a hierarchy developed. So there were still people in charge. There were still people that had advantage over others. So this type of parity, this type of collectivism that everyone was looking for didn't exist. It's a fallacy. It's a fantasy. But the Khmer Rouge believed very strongly in it, and especially the social engineering part of the equation. What was interesting about the Khmer Rouge is that they were not only brutal and killed literally millions of people through either overt or indirect actions such as famine and disease, but they dismantled the order of society. They literally separated families when they took them out of the city. They had this concept, as I said in the last episode, of new people, which were those in the cities, and old people or base people, who were those that they heavily supported in rural areas. Because remember, the Khmer Rouge came from the jungles. And when they emptied the cities and they sent these new people to the rural areas in forced labor to work in the fields, they didn't know how to grow anything. They weren't farmers. And so it was an abject disaster from the standpoint of creating famine and creating a disorder in society. But even more than that, it created the implosion of the family structure. Many Cambodians today have no idea where their families are. They were scattered to the winds. Children were separated from their parents. If the parents survived, they had no idea where their children were. Siblings were ripped apart. The whole family structure was annihilated. And children were handed off indiscriminately to either forced marriages with Khmer Rouge soldiers or to families that supported the Khmer Rouge. And I'm told by Lee and others that even though all of her family she knows did not survive, she has friends that she said could walk by their brother or sister in the street in Phnom Penh and not know them because they were separated and have never seen each other again. So it wasn't only the deaths, it wasn't only the genocide, it was this destruction of the fabric of society by the Khmer Rouge that altered Cambodia's course in recent history. As I said, the Khmer Rouge murdered hundreds of thousands of their perceived political opponents. And their racist emphasis on national purity resulted in the genocide of Cambodian minorities. The Khmer Rouge summarily executed and tortured perceived subversive elements, or they killed them during genocidal purges of their ranks between 1975 and 1979. The interesting thing about the Khmer Rouge, and this has been true about other revolutionary groups as well, is that they start off eradicating their opposition. That's the first thing they do. Eradicate the opposition, whether that's in government or those that support the government. Then eradicate minority groups that they don't agree with. And when all that's done, then the only thing that's left is beginning to purge from within, turning on each other. And that's exactly what the Khmer Rouge did. Lee shared with me a story that I thought was interesting, and I want to share it with you. One of the codicils, if you will, of the Khmer Rouge was that no one was supposed to feel inferior to anyone else. You were all brothers or sisters. You were not supposed to exalt yourself among anyone else. And if you did that, and it became noticed, it could cause challenges for you. And Lee talked about a guard in Tool Sling prison, S21. And by the way, S21 wasn't the only re-education center or prison that the Khmer Rouge set up. It was one of the most notorious, but it wasn't the only one. They were all over the country. But there was a particular guard there, evidently, who was very good at what he did. He believed strongly in what the Khmer Rouge was doing, and he was brutal. He literally executed and tortured thousands of prisoners. And he was so good at what he did that eventually there were those who sought to destroy him because they were either jealous or they felt like he had too much power. And in the end, he was arrested, put in S21, tortured, and killed. Why? Because he was too good at what he did, and he became too visible and overly important according to the Khmer Rouge, even though he was one of them. They turned on each other. The Khmer Rouge leadership turned on each other. The destruction of the Khmer Rouge ultimately came because they turned on each other. Because they had already purged the intellectuals. They had already purged the ethnic groups. There was nothing left to do but to then purge within their own party. Ultimately, the Cambodian genocide took place under the Khmer Rouge and led to deaths of 1.5 to 2 million people. Think about that. 1.5 to 2 million people. But let me put this in perspective. That's around 25% of Cambodia's overall population. This is unbelievable. In the period between 1975 and 1979, these forest people, many of them illiterate, most of them with no concept of governmental structure, this loosely woven group called the Khmer Rouge eradicated 25% of the country's population. That's unbelievable to me. And at the same time, as I said, totally eroded the country's societal structure and its economy. The Khmer Rouge's economic policy was based on the plans of Khieu Samphan and focused on the achievement of national self-reliance through agricultural collectivism. Agricultural collectivism essentially was creating collective farms, moving people out of cities, putting them on farms where they could raise fruits, vegetables, rice to feed themselves and the country. At the same time, the Khmer Rouge carried out a radical program that included isolating the country from foreign influences. They closed schools, they closed hospitals, they closed factories, they abolished banking, they abolished currency. And all of this led to them collectivizing agriculture. It was what they called the super great leap forward. Listen to that phrase, the super great leap forward. This sounds like a phrase that first or second graders would come up with to describe a game they were playing. And yet the Khmer Rouge was playing a game that had devastating stakes for everyone involved. Khmer Rouge theorists who developed the ideas of Hu Yuan and Khieu Samphan believed that an initial period of self-imposed economic isolation and national self-sufficiency would stimulate the rebirth of crafts as well as the rebirth of the country's latent industrial capability. In other words, they believed that they needed to pause society. And by pausing society, they could restructure it and reorder it in a way that would eventually lead to increased prosperity. In other words, they had to deconstruct the current society in order to construct a new society that they believed would be one of parity and one of prosperity. Regrettably, their assumption was grossly incorrect. Not even regrettably. It was obvious, had they looked at other iterations where this same approach or a similar approach had been tried, that it wasn't going to work. But they did no such research, and they believed strongly, under Chinese influence, that this approach, this deconstruction approach that would lead to the construction of a new and prosperous society, would be successful. In Phnom Penh and other cities, the Khmer Rouge told residents that they would be moved only about 2 or 3 kilometers away from the city and would return in 2 or 3 days. Some witnesses said they were told that the evacuation was because of the threat of American bombing, and they were also told they did not have to lock their houses since the Khmer Rouge would take care of everything until they returned. This has eerie similarity to the approach the Nazis used with the Jews in World War II. Oh, go ahead and leave your homes. They're fine. We'll take care of them. You don't have anything to worry about. We're protecting you. You'll be back soon. Only to realize too late that that was not the case. If the people refused to evacuate, they'd be immediately killed and their homes would be burned to the ground. The evacuees were sent on long marches to the countryside, which in itself killed literally thousands of children, elderly, and sick people who couldn't make that march. They either were too young or too frail to make that type of march. But realize these were not the first evacuation of the civilian population by the Khmer Rouge. Similar evacuations of populations without possessions had occurred on a smaller scale in the 1970s. But once the Khmer Rouge took over the major cities, especially the capital Phnom Penh, this was done en masse. On arrival to the villages which they'd been assigned, the evacuees were required to write brief autobiographical essays. The essay's content, particularly with regard to the subject's activity during the Khmer Republic regime, was used to determine their fate. You remember in the first episode, I told you at S21 how the Khmer Rouge was very proud of what they did. When you arrived at S21, they would take your photo and you would write this autobiographical essay. Actually, it was tantamount to a confession. And if the confession wasn't sufficient enough, then you were tortured until you were able to write a sufficient confession. But in most cases, that confession sealed your fate. Military officers and those occupying elite professional roles were usually sent for re-education, which in practice meant immediate execution or confinement in labor camps. Those with specialist technical skills often found themselves sent back to cities to restart production in factories where it had been interrupted. The remaining displaced urban population, which, as I said before, were called new people, were assigned to agriculture communes alongside the base people who were farmers previously. Cambodians were expected to produce 3 tons of rice per hectare, whereas before the Khmer Rouge average was 1 ton per hectare. So think about this. They sent people to the fields, to these collective farms, who were urbanites. Most had never grown anything. And yet they wanted to triple their production of things like rice. It was a fantasy. And when this didn't happen, rather than admitting that their approach had failed, they blamed those who were sent, the new people who were sent from the cities. Either they weren't working hard enough or they were causing difficulty, which led to mass executions. This lack of agriculture knowledge by the former city dwellers made famine inevitable, and it happened very, very quickly. And in addition, they were sent to these agriculture communes where the rural population were often unsympathetic or were too frightened to assist them. Such acts as picking wild fruit or berries were seen as a private enterprise and punished with death. Laborers were forced to work long shifts without adequate food or rest, which resulted in many deaths from exhaustion, illness, and starvation. Workers were executed for attempting to escape the communes, for breaching minor rules, or for being denounced by colleagues. If caught, offenders were often taken into a distant forest or field after sunset and executed. Unwilling to import Western medicines, the regime turned to traditional medicines and placed medical care in the hands of cadres who only had rudimentary training. The famine forced labor and lack of access to appropriate services, and that led to a huge number of deaths. So this was not just an approach by the Khmer Rouge to destroy their enemies. This was a destruction of Cambodian society. This deconstruction, as I said before, that they hope would lead to the reconstruction of something better, which of course did not happen. According to a 2001 academic source, the most widely accepted estimates of deaths under the Khmer Rouge were 1.5 to 2 million. That's unbelievable, as I said. And all of this converged, this genocide, the economic collapse, the famine, the erosion of societal structure, all of this led to a situation in Cambodia that became so dire that even its neighbors and former supporters, the Vietnamese, had to take action. And in 1979, the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia and pushed out the Khmer Rouge government. In one of her lighter moments, Lee joked with me that you know a country is in a bad situation when it has to be saved by the Vietnamese. But that's exactly what happened. The Khmer Rouge had been suspect of the Vietnamese for quite some time. And in fact, in 1975, they had invaded Vietnam as a proactive step to prevent what they felt like was an imminent invasion from Vietnam. But that attack was repelled, and from then on, the die was cast between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians. Especially since some Cambodians were seen to have given aid and comfort to Americans during the Vietnam War. So, the Vietnamese dislodged Khmer Rouge government. The Khmer Rouge fled back into the forest, including their leadership under Pol Pot, and really continued with a guerrilla war for some time. But again, without a country to govern, and with their enemies now back in charge, the Khmer Rouge began to turn on themselves. And by 1999, it was essentially defunct. The last of the Khmer Rouge surrendered to government forces in 1999. The new government that was put in place by the Vietnamese put in place a council called the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia, which was a tribunal for the Khmer Rouge. It's interesting, though, because the council itself never really unearthed many of the perpetrators of this genocide. They did, in fact, prosecute some of the Khmer Rouge leadership, but as of 2020, there were just 3 open cases left. One of the most high-profile cases was that of the head of Tuol Sleng Prison, S21, who I believe, if I remember right, was sentenced to 15 or 20 years in prison for his crimes. But most of the leadership of the Khmer Rouge simply faded into the jungle and were never brought to justice. As I said, there were a number of leaders within the Khmer Rouge, but its primary leader, and the one that was most visible and probably most responsible for a lot of the atrocities committed by the Khmer Rouge, was Pol Pot. As I said in the last episode, Pol Pot's real name was Saloth Sar, which sounds like the name of a villain in a Superman movie. But this man, Saloth Sar, became one of the most brutal leaders in recent history. Saloth Sar, Pol Pot, was born to a prosperous farmer in French Cambodia. He was educated at some of Cambodia's most elite schools. He arrived in Paris in October 1949 on an academic scholarship, and shortly after that, joined the Communist Party. He returned to Cambodia in 1953 and involved himself in the Khmer Viet Minh organization and its guerrilla war against the king's newly independent government. Following their retreat into North Vietnam, Pol Pot returned to Phnom Penh and worked as a teacher while remaining as a central member of Cambodia's Marxist-Leninist movement. In 1959, he helped formalize the movement into the Kampuchean Labour Party, which was later renamed the Communist Party of Kampuchea, CPK. To avoid state repression in 1962, he relocated to a jungle encampment, and in 1963 became CPK's leader. In 1968, he relaunched the war against the king's government. But after Lon Nol ousted the king in 1970, Pol Pot's forces sided with the deposed leader against the new government, which was bolstered by the United States military. At that time, they were aided by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops, and they made advances and controlled all of Cambodia by 1975. So here is a young man who is well educated, who came from a middle to upper class background, who rebranded himself as a base person, who rebranded himself as someone who was fighting against the elite, who was taking up the cause of the common man, who actually went to the jungle to live with them. But it is a great myth that Pol Pot was a product of the jungle. He wasn't. He was a product of the same elite that he ultimately tried to destroy. Now, he was not from Phnom Penh. He was a farmer, or the son of a farmer. So there was some connection there. But he was a very successful farmer, and he was well educated. And yet many of those he tried to exterminate were the same type of individuals who were educated as he was. Pol Pot transformed Cambodia into a one-party state. As I said before, it was called Democratic Kampuchea. And he sought to create an agrarian socialist society that he believed would eventually evolve into a communist one. And he came up with this concept called Year Zero. And basically, Year Zero was a concept where Pol Pot believed that all cultures and traditions must be completely destroyed and a new revolutionary culture developed from scratch. That was this deconstruction that I talked about before, which they hoped to lead to reconstruction of a different culture. They called it Year Zero. And Year Zero was announced by the Khmer Rouge on April 17th, 1975, when they officially took over the country and invaded the capital city. And everything before that date had to be purged. This is why the Khmer Rouge set about to deconstruct society as a whole. Not just infuse communist values, not just destroy their enemies and the ethnic groups that they didn't like, but really to erase the former society. It's an unbelievable concept. It is the most radical form of communist thought that you can really conceive. The Khmer Rouge emptied cities. They frog marched Cambodians to labor camps and relocated the urban population to collective farms. There was mass executions, abuse, torture, manipulation of culture, malnutrition, disease. It's unbelievable. And this led to a concept called the killing fields, where massive numbers of Cambodians would be taken to rural areas, to clearings, to the forest, and executed. I walked through several of those killing fields myself, which are now memorials, and saw the skulls piled high with those victims that Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge had destroyed. Pursuing complete egalitarianism, money, religion, and private property were abolished, and all citizens forced to wear the same black clothing. But again, the CPK was its own worst enemy. And by 1978, Cambodian soldiers were beginning to break with the Khmer Rouge and mounting a rebellion in the east. After several years of Khmer Rouge incursions and massacres in Vietnamese territory, Vietnam invaded Cambodia in December of 1978. By January of 1979, Pol Pot and his regime had been toppled, and he fled to the jungle. Somewhere along the Thai border, it's never been really determined exactly where their leadership was located in any one period of time. They continued to fight for several years, but were severely weakened and were hunted down by Vietnamese soldiers until the Vietnamese pulled out in 1989. In declining health, Pol Pot stepped back from many of his roles in the movement. In 1998, Khmer Rouge commander Tom Mok replaced him and put him under house arrest. And shortly after that, Pol Pot died in relative peace in the jungle. After all of this, after all of the horror that this man and his cronies had meted out on the country, most of them died free men. On the run, yes, but certainly not in a government prison. Pol Pot is buried in a spot near where he died in the jungles of Cambodia. This is a pretty macabre story. What does this tell us? Well, what it tells us is that when people become disenfranchised, they begin to believe things that are overtly not true. And when the people are either unwilling or unable to determine for themselves what's true and not true, where their ideas are coalesced by those who don't see multiple sides of an equation, they only see one. When discussion and debate are stamped out, when fear and distrust takes over society, nothing good comes of that. Only bad. And this is what happened in Cambodia. It's what happened in Vietnam. It's what happened in Serbia. It's what happened in Bosnia. It's what happened in Croatia. It's what happened in Rwanda. It's what happened in Iraq, Iran. Name your conflict location. West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, or Israel rather. Pick your conflict area. It's the same toxic cocktail of people who begin to believe something that is not true out of desperation, out of fear, or because they trust the people who are delivering this message so dogmatically that they don't seek to learn the truth for themselves. And by the way, all of the scenarios that I just outlined for you, most of that happened before social media. It's even worse now, where those who view social media every day can easily believe things that are absolutely not true. And where they can use social media only to reinforce what they already believe instead of looking at different sides of an issue and being responsible enough to learn the truth on their own. So I wish I could say that something like occurred in Cambodia will never happen again. But I can't say that because it's happening right before our eyes. Where people lose hope, they begin to have fear. They begin to lose their ability or give up their ability to learn the truth. That's where people like Pol Pot and others can begin to make inroads in society. Cambodia is a tragic tale, but it's not just about that country. This approach, this toxic cocktail, as I said, has been proliferated around the world by megalomaniacs. It's a cautionary tale. And I hope if you get nothing else out of this episode, it's this. Be careful who you listen to. Be careful who you believe. Do your research. Learn the truth. And realize that no political party, no government, no individuals are always right or always wrong. That there's always middle ground. That's why I think it's detestable on social media to see people criticizing each other in a way where it's clear that they're not even willing to listen to another side of an argument. That's what creates issues like this. That's what creates situations like this. Those of us sitting in the United States can say, oh, well, this could never happen to us because we're intellectuals. We are educated. We know better. Well, actually, it did happen to us during the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. And if we think it couldn't happen again, we're living in a state of delusion and denial. So those of us in the United States, Europe, countries all around the world that call themselves democratic societies, had better heed this cautionary tale from Cambodia. I hope that you've enjoyed these 2 episodes about this fascinating country. You should visit there. Don't let anything I've said deter you, pardon me, from putting Cambodia on your bucket list to visit, because it is categorically fantastic. And I would love for you to meet the people there and experience the same culture that I did when I worked there. Have a great day, a great week, and I'll see you next time on some stops along the way.